Power is often described as rigid because it fears change. The assumption is that authority clings to familiar forms out of habit or ideology, that reform fails because leaders refuse to imagine alternatives. But there is a quieter contradiction at the center of power itself. The more authority succeeds at coordinating a vast system, the more it depends on delay, mediation, and controlled interpretation. Speed becomes dangerous not because power resists it, but because power is built to survive without it. The Soviet Union did not fail to reform because it moved too slowly. It failed because the structure of its authority could not move quickly without dissolving the very mechanisms that made it legible to itself. This story is not about an empire surprised by history. It is about an authority that had already won, already stabilized, and already learned how to govern through time rather than responsiveness. The question is not why reform came late, but why earlier reform would have been unintelligible to the system attempting it. The stakes are not ideological. They are structural. When power governs through accumulation and mediation, acceleration does not liberate it. Acceleration exposes it. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union governed nearly 300 million people across 11 time zones. Its authority rested on a dense lattice of institutions: the Communist Party, the Council of Ministers, the Supreme Soviet, the military-industrial complex, and the security services. Economic coordination flowed through Gosplan, which issued targets and allocations across tens of thousands of enterprises. Information moved upward through layers of reporting that rewarded stability, compliance, and consistency. Decisions moved downward through directives refined to avoid ambiguity. The system was designed to minimize surprise. It did this well for decades. The legitimacy of Soviet authority did not depend on immediate performance. It depended on endurance. Victory in the Second World War, rapid industrialization, and superpower status created a political environment in which delay could be framed as prudence. Shortages were normalized. Inefficiencies were absorbed. The system did not promise speed. It promised permanence. By the time reform became an explicit objective, the Soviet state had already optimized itself for a world in which time could be managed rather than confronted. Inside the party, authority was distributed through position rather than initiative. Advancement depended on navigating consensus, not disrupting it. Feedback was filtered at every level, not out of deception alone, but out of self-preservation. A factory director who reported failure threatened not only his position, but the credibility of the plan that justified his existence. A regional secretary who acknowledged instability risked signaling loss of control. Over time, the system learned how to hear reassurance more clearly than warning. This was not corruption in the moral sense. It was alignment with the incentives of authority. As economic growth slowed in the 1970s, the system responded with familiar tools: adjustment of targets, reclassification of outputs, expansion of credit within state banks. These measures preserved continuity. They also increased opacity. The gap between reported performance and lived reality widened gradually, not enough to provoke crisis, but enough to distort decision-making. Authority did not lose control. It lost resolution. When Mikhail Gorbachev rose to General Secretary in 1985, the authority he inherited was still intact. The party commanded obedience. The military remained loyal. The state could still enforce decisions. What had changed was not the presence of power, but its sensitivity. Signals that once indicated minor strain now masked systemic exhaustion. Reform was framed not as a rupture, but as an update. Perestroika to restructure the economy, glasnost to increase transparency. The language suggested adjustment within continuity. Yet the first reforms immediately encountered a structural paradox. Economic decentralization required enterprises to respond to local conditions. But local responsiveness depended on information that had long been suppressed or smoothed. Allowing that information to surface did not simply improve efficiency. It altered the perceived competence of authority itself. Delays once interpreted as normal now appeared as failures. Shortages once tolerated as systemic costs now appeared as evidence of mismanagement. Reform did not create dissatisfaction, it reclassified it. Silence, which had functioned as a stabilizing buffer, was replaced by speech. Newspapers published criticisms, television aired debates, archives opened selectively. Each act of openness removed a layer of insulation between authority and perception. The party was no longer the sole narrator of its own performance. This did not immediately weaken its coercive capacity. It weakened its interpretive monopoly. At the same time, economic reforms disrupted established chains of obligation. Managers granted autonomy faced price signals they had never learned to read. Ministries lost direct control without gaining reliable substitutes. The plan loosened before a market existed to replace it. Authority still issued directives, but their consequences became unpredictable. When outcomes diverged from expectations, the system lacked mechanisms for rapid correction. The delay that once preserved stability now amplified error. National republics experienced this shift differently. For decades, the Soviet center had governed diversity through administrative boundaries and controlled representation. Identity was managed through institutions that translated local variation into standardized political forms. Glasnost altered this balance. Local grievances, once absorbed into bureaucratic language, began to circulate publicly. Authority could still suppress them, but suppression now contradicted the narrative of reform. Each intervention revealed the limits of consent the system had assumed rather than measured. The attempted acceleration of reform exposed another constraint. Authority had no neutral vantage point from which to evaluate itself. Every assessment was internal. Every metric was inherited. When reformers argued for speed, they relied on data produced by the same institutions whose credibility was in question. When conservatives argued for caution, they invoked stability defined by prior success. There was no external standard that could adjudicate between them without undermining the premise of centralized authority. A pause followed. Not silence, but hesitation. Laws were passed, then revised. Enterprises were granted freedoms, then constrained. Price reforms were discussed, delayed, partially implemented. Each delay was rational within the system. Each compounded uncertainty outside it. Authority still believed control was possible, but the horizon of control was narrowing. Decisions no longer closed possibilities. They exposed new ones the system could not absorb. The fracture did not arrive as a single moment. It emerged as a recognition within authority that its instruments no longer scaled to its ambitions. Coercion remained available, but its use threatened the reform narrative. Persuasion was attempted, but the authority had never practiced it without compulsion. Legitimacy, once derived from endurance and victory, now required responsiveness. Responsiveness required speed. Speed required trust in information the system had spent decades learning to doubt. By 1990, the party still governed. The Soviet state still existed. Yet authority increasingly encountered its own reflection as delay. Attempts to re-centralize contradicted decentralization already in motion. Attempts to liberalize revealed inequalities long managed through uniform scarcity. Each choice foreclosed another. Reform did not fail because it was resisted. It failed because it advanced into a space the authority had no experience inhabiting. The final year compressed these tensions without resolving them. Power did not vanish. It fragmented. Institutions retained formal authority but lost coherence. Orders were issued and ignored. Loyalty became conditional. The center could still command, but could no longer synchronize. When the system ended, it did so not as a collapse of force, but as a loss of coordination. Authority remained present until it could no longer recognize itself as singular. The Soviet Union could not reform fast enough because speed was not a missing ingredient. Speed was an incompatible one. Authority had been built to manage time through accumulation, delay, and mediation. When history demanded compression, the structure of power translated urgency into distortion. Reform accelerated perception faster than authority could adapt. The system did not choose to stop. It reached the point where continuation no longer resembled control. What remains unsettling is not that the system failed, but that it functioned exactly as designed until the conditions of legitimacy changed. Power did not misunderstand the moment. It encountered a version of itself it had never needed to become. If you found meaning here, you're welcome to explore more on Timeless Questions, where we examine history not for answers, but for understanding.